recent case of the soldier in Afghanistan, Robert Gale. This is a story several weeks ago of a soldier who was on, I think, his 4th deployment. And at least the charges that are alleged is he left his base at least once, maybe twice, and gunned down several Iraqi families, including women and children. A completely, quote, senseless crime. And when a crime doesn't make sense, what we try to do is inject some sense into it. Why would someone do this? And because he was a soldier, and because he had so many deployments, the immediate explanation that people are leaping to is that he's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And many soldiers who return from war, from as long as there have been wars, as well as civilian tragedies such as mass disasters or workplace violence or school shooting incidents, may suffer this syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder. But again, as we've talked about in other segments, the leap from the diagnosis of a particular disorder to not being responsible for one's entire behavior is a leap we have to make with caution. So let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. It's been called many things in the past. It's been called battle fatigue, shell shock, soldier's heart, irritable heart syndrome, but it only has existed as a diagnosis as recently as 1980. And in 1980, largely as a result of the experiences of soldiers returning from the Vietnam War, when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Edition 3, was first put together, post-traumatic stress disorder was included in that diagnostic manual. And the criteria for the diagnosis are pretty much the same that were then as they are today. And there are 4 basic criteria. The first is relatively unique because post-traumatic stress disorder is the only disorder, except for one other minor one, it's the only disorder that requires us to know what caused it. That is, this is called the stressor criterion, criteria number 1. There has to be an identifiable event that you can peg the syndrome onto. And that's because, as I'll discuss in a moment, the actual symptoms are not that specific. So in order for it to be post-traumatic stress disorder, we first have to identify that traumatic event. It could be an improvised explosive device detonating under your Humvee in Afghanistan. It could be a terrible car accident in which you saw a relative killed. It could be almost losing your life in a flood when your house got swept away by Hurricane Katrina. But there's got to be some identifiable event. The second is what's called intrusive re-experiencing. That is, the individual cannot get the experience out of their mind. They think about it all the time. They ruminate about it all the time. When they go to sleep at night, they may dream about it or other experiences like it. They can't get rid of it. And probably the most dramatic symptom of PTSD, even though it's the most unusual, is what's called a dissociative flashback, where the person, perhaps due to some trigger in the environment, perhaps just spontaneously, will suddenly believe that they are back in the danger zone and may behave in ways that replicate what they went through when they were back on the battlefield or in the car wreck or whatever. In most cases of PTSD, the person who does hallucinate during this dissociative experience will be aware that this is not really happening. In fact, I've had patients come in and describe this phenomenon and say, "Doc, you're going to really think I'm nuts." Why? Because I was driving down the road and I saw that red pickup truck that hit me coming at me, but I knew it wasn't really there. I must be crazy. My response to that is no. If you were crazy, you would have really thought the pickup truck was there. That you were having a dissociative experience, but you were having it in clear consciousness. So in a small number of cases, will the person actually believe, for example, that the waiter in the Chinese restaurant coming to refill their tea with their teapot is really a Viet Cong soldier holding a bomb, at which point the person jumps up and pummels the poor waiter to death. So acts of violence committed during a dissociative flashback are extremely, extremely rare. Criteria number 3 is numbing and avoidance, almost in a reaction to being overwhelmed and bombarded by these stimuli and these reminiscences that the person wants to get rid of. The mind will try to shut itself off. They'll avoid any reference to the event. They won't watch TV shows that remind them of the event. They will sequester themselves in their rooms and try not to think about things. In some cases, they may turn to drugs and alcohol just to numb themselves so they don't have to think about this. And finally, the 4th criterion is heightened arousal. That is, the individual is on red alert all the time. They're like a raw nerve. And again, all these put together combine to produce the syndrome of PTSD. But even if someone has PTSD, it is not a, first of all, PTSD in about 85% of cases is recoverable. Most people with severe PTSD, 12 to 18 months post-event, will show signs of recovery. Recovery doesn't mean that it's all over and they're 100% back to normal, but it means that it's at least not severe enough that it's having an appreciable effect on their life. But in that small minority, that 10 or 15%, they may have persistent PTSD, and in some rare cases of that, a very small percentage of that, will that person commit violence. And again, that's almost always in response to this hallucinatory, dissociative flashback where the person believes they're back in the danger zone and feels compelled to defend themselves. And unless, in the case we're talking about this Robert Gale, unless they can prove that that was his state of mind during the commission of these murders, the PTSD defense is going to be a very difficult one to make legitimately. That doesn't mean he was not under stress from 4 deployments. That doesn't mean that other things may have been going on in his life. But guess what? How many thousands of soldiers have been deployed? How many thousands of soldiers have had multiple deployments? How many thousands of veterans now are struggling with PTSD? And thank God they're not all going out killing people. So again, it's a combination of the event, a combination of the stressor, but it's also based on that person's pre-existing personality. And the flip side of this, aside from not unfairly exonerating people who may be responsible for a crime, is the other way around. After the Vietnam War, the stereotype of the postal vet, the vet who goes postal, of the crazy Vietnam vet who could explode at a moment's notice and blow up a building, came to be very popular. And because of a few rare instances of that happening, the public began to see all returning veterans as these ticking bombs who were inherently dangerous. It would be a tremendous disservice to the veterans who are home now who are struggling with PTSD for people to avoid them because they think that they're dangerous based on a few of these glaring cases that are reported in the media. Once again, in psychology and criminal justice, it's a matter of the person, the background, and the event that determines what's going to cause violent behavior in any given case.